How dare you? You think you can just come in here and take over? Well, you're wrong.
What if one quiet decision at 30,000 feet could expose the truth the world had ignored for too long? What if a single man's refusal to surrender his dignity turned an ordinary flight into a storm that shook an entire industry? On a late-night journey bound for San Francisco, Malcolm Harlow boarded his first-class seat just like any other passenger. But when another man's entitlement collided with his right to exist without question, the cabin became a stage for something far larger than travel. Flight attendants chose sides, accusations flew, and the hum of engines was drowned by the weight of silence, until one question shattered it. Why had no one apologized? A phone camera captured it all. Within hours, millions were watching. A CEO was forced to intervene mid-flight. Promises were made, and careers unraveled in real time. But beneath the headlines was a deeper story about dignity, bias, and the courage to remain still when everything tried to move you aside. What would you have done? Stayed silent or spoken out? Stay with us as we unfold the story, and before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the moments that matter. The hum of the terminal was steady, like a low tide rolling in and out. Malcolm Harlow walked through the jet bridge with an ease that came from years of travel, his leather carry-on balanced in his hand, his ticket tucked neatly inside his jacket pocket. To the other passengers around him, he looked like just another man boarding another flight. But Malcolm was far from ordinary. At 46, his presence carried weight, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet authority that seemed to radiate from his calm eyes. Malcolm had long ago mastered the art of blending patience with resolve. His salt and pepper beard gave him an air of experience, and his steady gait projected confidence. Yet what most couldn't see was the quiet storm inside him, a storm that had been brewing for decades, shaped by countless small humiliations and subtle exclusions. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, Malcolm inhaled the faint scent of leather seats mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The lighting was warm, almost theatrical, casting a golden sheen across the cabin. Other passengers were already settling in, a businesswoman flipping through her laptop, a middle-aged couple murmuring in low tones, a younger man taking a selfie for his social media feed. Malcolm found his seat 1A, window side, his favorite spot. He set his bag neatly overhead, then lowered himself into the plush leather chair. The seat cradled him, and for a moment he allowed himself to exhale. Flying was never just flying for him. It was an act of entering a system where assumptions often weighed heavier than facts. He recalled, almost involuntarily, the memory of being 12 years old in his hometown of Raleigh. His mother had taken him to a diner. They had waited nearly 30 minutes, ignored, while others were served, when his mother finally confronted the waitress. She had smiled tightly and said, "We're just very busy." Malcolm remembered the shame in his mother's eyes, though she tried to hide it. That memory still stung, buried deep under years of achievements and victories that were supposed to make him untouchable. But old wounds had long memories. Now, sitting in the comfort of first class, he felt the same flicker of uncertainty he always did. Would this flight be quiet, uneventful, or would the old ghosts of prejudice find a way to remind him they were still alive? A flight attendant passed by, smiling mechanically. Her name tag read Clara Jennings. She offered him a perfunctory nod, but paused a little longer when greeting the businessman 2 rows behind him. Malcolm noticed it, but said nothing. Years had taught him the futility of reacting to every slight. As boarding continued, Malcolm allowed himself a moment of reflection. He wasn't just a passenger. He was the chairman of Harlow Capital, an investment group with holdings across multiple industries including aviation. Few on this plane, perhaps none, knew that his firm was the single largest shareholder of the very airline operating this flight. Power, for Malcolm, had always been quiet. He didn't need to flaunt it. He simply carried it, like a steady current beneath the surface. Yet tonight, he wasn't thinking about board meetings or shareholder reports. He was thinking about the speech he would give the next morning in San Francisco. It was a keynote on leadership in turbulent times. He had drafted lines about dignity, responsibility, and the unseen battles leaders must endure. Little did he know that this flight would give him a story that would echo louder than any prepared speech. The last passengers filed in, and the cabin grew fuller. The overhead bins clicked shut. Flight attendants scurried with professional urgency, and announcements crackled overhead. Malcolm adjusted the seatbelt across his lap, glanced out the window at the tarmac lights blinking against the night, and felt the faintest smile tug at his lips. Peace, he thought. Just let it be peaceful. But peace is fragile. The scrape of a rolling suitcase interrupted his quiet. A tall, impeccably dressed man with sharp features and slicked-back blonde hair stopped abruptly at Malcolm's row. His suit screamed old money. His wristwatch glittered under the cabin lights. The man frowned, then narrowed his eyes at Malcolm. "You're in my seat," the man said flatly, his voice carrying more entitlement than volume. Malcolm turned his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze. He had seen that expression before countless times. The certainty, the presumption, the disbelief that someone like Malcolm could belong where he was sitting. "I don't believe so," Malcolm replied calmly. His voice was low, measured, but firm. "This is 1A. The man scoffed, holding up his boarding pass without even glancing at it. "Yes, exactly. 1A. That's mine." Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some leaned in to listen. Others pretended not to notice but stole quick glances. The atmosphere, once warm and casual, had grown taut. Malcolm felt the storm inside stir again. He pressed it down, steadying his breath. He had been here before. Always here. Always asked to justify his place. Always presumed to be out of line. He leaned back slightly, eyes unwavering. "I have my boarding pass as well. Perhaps we should compare." The man bristled. His name, Malcolm would soon learn, was Sterling Whitford, and Sterling was not used to being questioned, certainly not by someone he had already dismissed with a glance. Clara Jennings appeared again, smiling at Sterling with the warmth of an old acquaintance. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, pointedly addressing only him. Sterling gestured toward Malcolm. "Yes, he's in my seat." Clara's eyes flicked to Malcolm briefly, then back to Sterling. Her tone softened. "I'm sure we can sort this out, sir. Why don't you step aside while I check with the lead flight attendant?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Step aside." The words rang louder than the announcement chime overhead. He had bought this seat. He had every right to be here. Yet already, without a single verification, the assumption was clear. He closed his eyes for half a second, hearing his mother's voice from long ago. "Hold your head high. Don't let them decide your worth." When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, calm, but inside, the storm gathered strength, and the flight, still on the ground, was already leaving peace behind. The tension in the cabin thickened like a storm cloud as Sterling Whitford stood firm in the aisle, arms folded, eyes narrowing on Malcolm Harlow. Clara Jennings lingered nearby, her posture angled toward Sterling as if she were already convinced of his claim. Passengers leaned ever so slightly in their seats, trying not to look like they were staring, but drawn to the unfolding conflict like moths to a flame. Malcolm remained seated, his back pressed lightly against the leather, his voice measured when he finally spoke. "I purchased this seat, sir, 1A. If you'd like, we can have the attendant confirm both our boarding passes." Sterling smirked as though the suggestion were beneath him. He waved his hand dismissively. "I don't need confirmation. I know where my seat is. This is it. And frankly, you're holding things up." His tone carried a subtle insult, laced with the unspoken message that Malcolm's presence was the inconvenience. Clara placed a hand gently on Sterling's shoulder, almost soothing, and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Whitford. I'll get the lead flight attendant to resolve this." Her voice softened as though she were reassuring a valuable customer, but when she turned to Malcolm, her tone sharpened. "Sir, if you could just step into the aisle for a moment. We'll clear this up quickly. Step into the aisle." Again, that phrase echoed like a verdict. Malcolm glanced at the faces around him. Some avoided his eyes, embarrassed for him, or perhaps complicit in silence. A few watched with quiet sympathy. One young woman in row 2, he noticed her discreetly raising her phone, angling it toward the scene. He would learn her name later, Isabella Vega. Malcolm inhaled deeply, his voice steady. "With respect, I'm seated where I belong. I'll remain here until the situation is clarified properly." Clara's lips tightened. She wasn't used to resistance, especially not phrased with such calm certainty. She straightened her shoulders and strode toward the front of the cabin to fetch her superior. Sterling leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Malcolm could hear. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just move. People like you don't understand how this works." Malcolm felt a spark ignite in his chest, but he contained it, pressing it down with years of practice. He had heard variations of those words all his life, in classrooms, in boardrooms, even in restaurants where the menus told one story but the service told another. People like you, always a dagger, always a dismissal. He looked Sterling squarely in the eye and replied softly, "On the contrary, I understand exactly how this works." The silence between them was sharp as glass. Moments later, Evelyn Cross, the lead flight attendant, arrived. Evelyn was tall, poised, with decades of service etched in the lines around her eyes. She looked from Sterling to Malcolm, her expression already tilting toward annoyance. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, though her tone implied she'd already chosen a side. Sterling gestured toward Malcolm, his hand flicking like he was brushing off dust. "He's in my seat, 1A. I fly this airline all the time. I don't know how this mix-up happened, but I need him moved." Evelyn nodded slowly, then turned to Malcolm with a curt smile that lacked warmth. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Malcolm reached calmly into his jacket pocket, retrieved the folded document, and offered it. Evelyn took it, glancing quickly before returning it. She didn't announce the result. Instead, she looked at Sterling with a tone of apology. We'll sort this out immediately, Mr. Whitford." Then, to Malcolm, "More firmly, sir. I'm going to ask you to stand while we verify with the gate." The words were sharper this time, less request and more command. Inside. Malcolm felt the storm roar. He wanted to shout, to demand they acknowledge the truth already written on his ticket, but he remembered his mother's voice once more. Dignity. Always dignity. He nodded slightly, but did not rise. "I will remain seated until there is an accurate verification," he said. His voice was calm, but his refusal was absolute. The cabin grew restless. A man 2 rows back muttered, "Come on, just switch already." Another sighed loudly, as though inconvenienced by the delay. A woman across the aisle whispered to her partner, "Why are they treating him like this?" The murmur spread, and with it, the sharp divide of opinions. Sterling's face reddened with irritation. "This is ridiculous. You're wasting everyone's time. Do you even know who I am?" Malcolm turned his gaze toward the window, then back to Sterling. "Do you?" he asked softly. The words hung in the air, cryptic yet heavy, and Sterling blinked as though he hadn't expected the question. Evelyn's patience wore thinner. "Sir," she said, addressing Malcolm again, "if you do not comply, I will have to call airport security. They can resolve this quickly." Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could feel the weight of every humiliation he had swallowed before. He could see the faces of board members who had questioned his judgment, not his colleagues. He could hear the echo of a banker once telling him he might be a bit ambitious for his background. How many times had he chosen silence, just to keep the peace? How many times had he convinced himself that enduring quietly was strength? But sitting here, with every eye upon him, he realized silence was no longer an option. He opened his eyes, his voice clear. "Then call them. Let them come. Let's see where this leads." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Sterling shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "Unbelievable." Evelyn pressed her lips into a thin line and picked up the intercom phone. Malcolm's heart thudded, but his exterior remained calm. He knew this was a risk. He knew stories of men dragged down aisles, videos gone viral, careers reduced to headlines. He wasn't blind to the danger, but something deeper anchored him the knowledge that giving in would only feed the cycle, while standing firm, even quietly, could break it. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, the tension suffocating. Isabella's phone was now raised higher, her eyes darting between Malcolm and the crew. She wasn't smiling or mocking, she was bearing witness. And in that moment, Malcolm realized the significance. For once, the truth might not stay hidden in the silence of memory. It might be seen. Minutes stretched long, each second sharp with anticipation. Evelyn set the phone back in its cradle, her expression unreadable. "Security will be here shortly," she announced. Sterling smirked as if victory were already his. "Finally," he said, settling his bag against the seat back as though reclaiming what was his by birthright. Malcolm turned his gaze to the window again. The tarmac lights blinked steadily in the darkness outside, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the metal shell of the aircraft. He breathed slowly, steadily, reminding himself that storms, no matter how violent, always pass. But some storms change the landscape forever. The aisle remained open. The hum of the plane systems filled in the silence, and Malcolm Harlow sat, unshaken, as the weight of history pressed down upon a single seat in first class. The minutes between Evelyn's call and the arrival of security stretched like an eternity. The air in the cabin grew heavier, thick with the unease of passengers who couldn't decide whether to look away or lean closer. Every second sharpened the lines between silence and complicity. Malcolm Harlow sat still, his eyes steady, hands folded in his lap. He could feel the invisible weight of judgment pressing against his chest. His calm posture belied the storm within. Each heartbeat carried memories, reminders of a lifetime spent negotiating spaces that were never designed for men like him. And now, here it was again, condensed into a single seat on an airplane. Sterling Whitford loomed just above, standing in the aisle like a self-appointed gatekeeper. He shifted his weight impatiently, sighing in exaggerated annoyance. "This is absurd," he muttered loudly, ensuring others heard. "We'd be in the air by now if certain people knew how to follow simple rules." A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin. A few heads turned away. Some eyes flicked toward Malcolm with quick sympathy, but no one spoke. The silence was its own language, one Malcolm knew too well. Clara Jennings returned from the front. Her expression set. She crouched slightly beside Sterling, lowering her voice but not enough to hide her words. "Don't worry. Mr. Whitford, we'll have this resolved. I'm so sorry you've been inconvenienced." Her tone dripped with reassurance, as though he were the true victim here. Then she turned to Malcolm, her voice shifting into clipped professionalism. "Sir, for the comfort of all passengers, please cooperate. We can reassign you another seat until this is settled." Another seat? The implication burned. He was being asked to surrender not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption. The assumption that he didn't belong here, that his presence in this leather seat disrupted the natural order. Malcolm's gaze rose slowly to meet Clara's. His voice was even, but it carried an edge honed by decades of restraint. "I have already complied with every rule. I am seated in the seat that I purchased. If this situation causes discomfort, it is not of my making." The firmness unsettled her. Clara straightened, muttering under her breath, "We'll see what security says." Sterling smiled faintly, convinced of victory. "Exactly. Let the professionals handle this." The cabin seemed to pulse with collective discomfort. A man across the aisle pulled out his newspaper, holding it high as though to shield himself from the scene. A young couple whispered rapidly in Spanish, their tones tense with disbelief. The woman in row 3 shook her head, mouthing silently to her husband, "This isn't right." Yet no one stood, no one intervened. Only Isabella Vega continued recording. She adjusted her phone subtly, ensuring she captured both Malcolm's calm dignity and Sterling's looming arrogance. Her journalist's instinct told her something important was happening here, something larger than a seat dispute. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. He thought of the speech he had prepared for tomorrow, about leadership in turbulent times. He had written a line about dignity being a form of power. Now, in this cabin filled with stares and whispers, he wondered if that line was prophetic or naive. He opened his eyes as Evelyn returned, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Security will be here shortly," she announced, her voice louder now, projecting authority. "In the meantime, we ask for patience from all passengers." Patience. The word landed with bitter irony. Patience had been the demand of his entire life. Wait your turn. Hold your tongue. Prove your worth again and again, while others sailed through unquestioned. Patience had been both shield and shackle. But tonight, patience had to wear a new face, not silent endurance, but unshaken presence. Sterling leaned closer again, his whisper sharp. "You're about to regret this little show. You think they'll take your side. Look around. Everyone knows who belongs up here." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He could taste the metallic tang of rage at the back of his throat, but he did not raise his voice. Instead, he turned his head toward Sterling, his eyes steady as stone. "I belong exactly where I am." The words were soft, but their weight was undeniable. Sterling blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the quiet conviction. He turned away quickly, muttering something under his breath. Clara busied herself with other passengers, but her gaze kept darting back to Malcolm, irritation etched into her expression. Evelyn hovered near the galley, waiting for security's arrival. The tension was no longer private. It was public theater, playing out across a captive audience of strangers strapped into their seats. A child in row 4 asked his mother in a stage whisper, "Why won't they let him sit?" The mother hushed him quickly, pulling him close, embarrassed. Yet the innocence of the question lingered, echoing louder than the whispers of adults. Malcolm's chest rose and fell slowly. He felt the pull of memory again, his first major boardroom presentation, when a senior executive had mistaken him for the assistant meant to fetch coffee. The laughter that had followed when he introduced himself as the presenter. He had smiled then, concealed the sting, and delivered a flawless presentation that silenced the room. But the memory had never left him. Now, as Sterling and the crew treated him like an intruder, that old wound flared hot, but unlike then, he would not bury it under silence. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice breaking through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a brief delay. Thank you for your cooperation." The words were neutral, but the passengers knew the truth. This was no ordinary delay. The cabin's air grew stale. The buzz of conversation had quieted, replaced by the hum of the engines and the low thrum of unspoken judgment. Malcolm glanced sideways and caught Isabella's eyes for the briefest moment. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. A silent acknowledgement. Someone was watching. Someone would remember. He leaned back in his seat, grounding himself. The storm inside raged louder now, demanding release. Yet he knew the true strength lay not in the explosion, but in the refusal to yield. The aisle remained clear, a stage waiting for its next act. And as Malcolm sat steadfast in seat 1A, prejudice unfolded openly around him, stripped of disguise, illuminated for all to see. What none of them realized was that this night would not end with silence. The storm would not pass quietly. Malcolm Harlow sat motionless in seat 1A, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his expression composed but distant. Around him, the cabin felt like a pressure chamber, filled with stares, whispers, and the uneasy silence of people who did not know which way to lean. Some passengers shifted in their seats with restless impatience. Others avoided looking at him altogether, but he could feel the judgment like static in the air. Inside, however, Malcolm's thoughts churned in violent currents. Every breath seemed to awaken old memories. He thought of his father, a quiet man who worked double shifts at the textile mill, who had once been pulled aside at a gas station because the clerk didn't believe he could afford the car he was driving. Malcolm had been in the back seat that day, only 10 years old, watching his father's jaw clench as he handed over the keys without protest. The humiliation of that moment had never left him. His father's silence had been both protection and surrender. Now, here he was, decades later, facing the same choice. To be silent was to stay safe, to avoid escalation, to let the flight proceed. But silence was also complicity. It was swallowing once more the bitter pill of indignity, reinforcing the very structure that made others believe they could strip his belonging with a glance. He could feel the eyes of Sterling Whitford bearing down on him, the smug certainty that entitlement would prevail. Clara Jennings, flitting about in nervous irritation, cast him glances that were more accusation than service. Evelyn Cross, standing like a sentinel at the galley, carried the full authority of the airline behind her, and beyond them, the unseen weight of airport security, summoned like hounds, closing in with every passing second. Malcolm's heart pounded, but not with fear. It was the rhythm of decision, of a man standing at the precipice of choice. He thought of the speech he had prepared for the following day. Words about courage, about leading in times when silence was easy but wrong. He had planned to deliver them from a podium, polished and rehearsed. Instead, life had placed him here, in this cabin, where courage could not be rehearsed but had to be lived. A voice deep inside whispered caution. He knew how quickly these situations could spiral. He had read the headlines, seen the videos of passengers dragged, cuffed, humiliated. He knew that the world often excused such actions, especially when directed at men who looked like him. If he resisted too firmly, if his calm cracked even for a moment, they would not see dignity, they would see danger. But another voice, quieter but stronger, spoke with the timbre of generations. It was his mother's voice, telling him to never forget who he was. It was the echo of his grandmother, who had marched in protests when she was barely older than Isabella Vega, now filming discreetly a row away. It was the memory of every time he had chosen silence and later regretted it. Malcolm straightened in his seat, not with aggression, but with certainty. He would not yield. Not this time. The announcement of security's impending arrival rattled through the cabin once more. A man behind him grumbled audibly about delays, muttering that he had a connection to catch. The collective impatience of strangers pressed against Malcolm like a tide, urging him to give in for the sake of convenience. But dignity was not a convenience. It was the essence of being. Sterling leaned in again, his whisper sharp with contempt. It's over. When security comes, they'll toss you out. Save yourself the embarrassment. Move. Malcolm turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with Sterling's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scowl. He simply said, "No." The word was soft, but it landed with the weight of stone dropped into water. Sterling blinked, unsettled by the refusal. For the first time, a sliver of uncertainty crossed his face. Clara approached again, her voice taut with authority she didn't truly hold. "Sir, I must insist. If you don't step aside voluntarily, this will get worse for you." Malcolm regarded her calmly, respectfully. "The only thing making this worse is the refusal to check the facts. You have my boarding pass. The truth is written on it. What more do you need?" Clara faltered for half a second before regaining her composure. "Security will determine that." The murmur in the cabin grew louder now, the tension spilling over. Some passengers whispered angrily about the delay. Others voiced quiet disapproval of how Malcolm was being treated. The division was stark, visible in every set of eyes. Malcolm's thoughts turned inward again. He remembered his first flight in first class, years ago, when he was younger and flush with the first success of his firm. He had felt proud, triumphant, as though he had finally crossed an invisible barrier. But even then, a fellow passenger had looked at him with raised brows and asked, "Are you sure you're in the right section?" He had laughed it off then, but tonight he realized how heavy that laugh had been, how it had cost him a piece of himself each time. He could not afford that cost anymore. The engines hummed beneath the floor, a reminder of the machine's power, of the journey meant to begin. But the real journey was here, now, in this suspended moment of choice. He shifted slightly, planting his feet firmly on the floor. His posture was not defiant, but resolute. He was not preparing for a fight, but for endurance. Whatever came next, security, confrontation, humiliation, he would meet it with the armor of his calm. He thought of his son, a teenager back home who had begun asking questions about the world, about why some doors opened easily for his friends but not for him. What lesson would he carry from his father tonight? That silence was survival, or that dignity, once surrendered, was nearly impossible to reclaim. Malcolm knew the answer. He was not sitting here for himself alone. Isabella's camera caught the flicker of determination in his eyes, the subtle shift of a man who had decided not to yield. Later, that image would spread across screens far beyond this cabin, but for now, it was simply the quiet choice of one man, rooted like stone against the tide. The moments dragged, passengers fidgeting, attendants exchanging uneasy glances. Malcolm remained still. The storm inside him had calmed, not because it had subsided, but because it had found its purpose. He whispered to himself, so softly no one else could hear, "This ends here." And with that, he waited for the inevitable arrival of security, prepared not to resist with force, but to resist with something far more unyielding, the power of presence, the refusal to vanish from the place he rightfully belonged. The cabin, caught between suspense and spectacle, held its breath. And Malcolm Harlow sat firm in seat 1A, the weight of history on his shoulders, the battle for dignity alive in his chest. The announcement that security was on its way spread through the cabin like a gust of cold air. Even those who had tried to ignore the dispute earlier were now riveted, their eyes darting between Malcolm Harlow and the crew who seemed determined to force him out of seat 1A. The hum of the plane systems felt louder than before, filling the silence with a mechanical tension. Malcolm remained still, his posture calm but resolute. Inside, his heartbeat was steadying, like a drummer finding a rhythm that could guide him through the storm. Every instinct told him to hold his ground, but the risk hovered in his mind like a shadow. He knew what security meant in situations like this. He had read the headlines, seen the videos, felt the collective ache of men who looked like him being treated as threats for simply existing where others believed they did not belong. Sterling Whitford stood tall in the aisle, basking in the attention. He straightened his jacket and spoke loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. This is what happens when people think rules don't apply to them. Some of us actually pay for these seats. His words were coated in arrogance, sharpened to wound. Malcolm turned his head toward him, his voice measured. "I paid for this seat too." Sterling scoffed. "Sure you did." He let the implication hang, his smirk widening as if the lie spoke for itself. The cruelty of it rippled through Malcolm's chest, not because the words surprised him, but because of how easily they flowed from Sterling's mouth, as natural as breathing. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the certainty, the assumption that his presence in first class had to be fraudulent. Clara Jennings appeared again, her expression stern. "Sir," she said to Malcolm, "when security arrives, you will need to comply. If you don't, you could face removal from the flight." Her words were sharp, but her eyes darted toward Sterling with a softness that betrayed her bias. She was protecting him, not Malcolm. Passengers murmured louder now. A man in row 2 muttered, "This is ridiculous." A woman in row 3 shook her head, whispering, "Why don't they just check both tickets properly?" The young boy from earlier asked his mother again, "Why don't they believe him?" The mother hushed him quickly, her face flushed with embarrassment. Malcolm leaned back, his eyes scanning the cabin. He saw their faces, their discomfort, their unwillingness to intervene. He didn't blame them, not entirely. Most people preferred silence to confrontation, comfort to disruption, but he also knew that silence was the soil where injustice thrived. He drew in a deep breath. His thoughts turned to his son again. What story would he tell him later, that he had given up his seat quietly, hoping to avoid trouble, or that he had stood firm, not with anger, but with dignity? The answer was clear. Evelyn Cross approached, her tone clipped. "Sir, I'm going to give you one last chance to move to another seat voluntarily. If you refuse, security will escort you out." Malcolm's eyes met hers. "I will not move from the seat I purchased. If security needs to come, then let them. But I will not be forced to surrender my dignity for your convenience." His words carried through the cabin like a spark. Some passengers looked down, ashamed. Others exchanged glances, as if silently agreeing but too afraid to say so. Isabella Vega, phone in hand, caught every moment. Her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes wide with the knowledge that this story was bigger than she had first imagined. Sterling chuckled under his breath, leaning toward Evelyn. "You see, he's making a scene. This is exactly why he doesn't belong here." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't correct him. Instead, she turned away, muttering into her intercom once more. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, listening to the sound of the engines, the restless shifting of passengers, the faint tapping of someone's fingers on an armrest. Every sound seemed magnified, every detail etched into his memory. He had the peculiar sense that this moment would not stay confined to the walls of this plane. It would echo beyond, into boardrooms, into headlines, into the consciousness of strangers who would one day hear his name. He opened his eyes just as Isabella shifted slightly in her seat, catching his gaze. For the first time, she allowed herself a small gesture, a nod, subtle but powerful. He nodded back almost imperceptibly. That was enough. He was not entirely alone. The minutes dragged. The plane remained stuck at the gate, passengers trapped in limbo. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, apologizing vaguely for the delay, his tone deliberately neutral. He did not mention the confrontation in first class, but everyone knew. The silence was too heavy, too pointed to ignore. Malcolm straightened his shoulders. The storm inside him had crystallized into something sharper, steadier. He was prepared. If security came, he would not resist with violence. He would resist with the strength of presence, the refusal to bow. Sterling leaned closer one last time, his whisper venomous. "They're going to drag you out, and when they do, Everyone will see you for what you are." Malcolm turned slowly, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "When they do, everyone will see you for what you are." The words landed like a mirror held up to Sterling's face. He pulled back, unsettled, though he tried to mask it with a sneer. The atmosphere was electric now, the entire cabin straining under the tension. Every passenger could feel it, the fragile balance before the storm breaks. The crew moved with urgency, preparing for the arrival of security. Malcolm's grip on the armrest tightened for just a moment, then loosened again. His breathing was steady. He whispered to himself, unheard by anyone else. "Stand firm." The plane was no longer just a machine waiting for takeoff. It had become an arena, and Malcolm sat at its center, unyielding, ready for the next act in a battle that was no longer just about a seat, but about something far greater. The cabin grew still, almost unnaturally quiet. As the doors at the front of the aircraft swung open, two men in dark uniforms stepped inside, their heavy boots striking the narrow aisle with measured authority. The air shifted instantly, passengers stiffening in their seats, whispers dissolving into silence. This was no longer just an argument about a seat. With the arrival of security, the weight of authority had entered the cabin, and everyone could feel it. The first officer moved quickly, his expression hard, jaw tight as though confrontation was already a foregone conclusion. His name tag read Officer Bradley Kane. His posture radiated impatience, his eyes scanning Malcolm with the practiced suspicion of someone who assumed guilt before evidence. The second officer followed more slowly, his presence calmer, his gaze deliberate. Officer Marcus Lang. Where Kane exuded aggression, Lang carried a quiet steadiness. He surveyed the scene carefully, taking in Sterling Whitford's rigid stance in the aisle, Clara Jennings hovering nervously nearby, Evelyn Cross waiting with her arms crossed, and finally Malcolm Harlow, still seated in 1A, composed but immovable. "Gentlemen," Evelyn began, her voice clipped, eager to pass the burden. "This passenger is refusing to comply with instructions. He is in the wrong seat and has delayed the flight." Her words fell into the silence like stones, and Malcolm felt the injustice of them press against his chest. Wrong seat, refusing to comply. The truth rewritten in real time, designed to cast him as the problem, the aggressor, the disruption. Officer Kane stepped forward, looming over Malcolm. "Sir, I need you to stand up immediately and come with us." His tone was sharp, commanding, the voice of someone accustomed to obedience. Malcolm looked up, meeting his eyes calmly. "Officer, I'm seated in the seat that I purchased. My boarding pass confirms it. If you would check, you will see that is the truth." Kane's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for games. Up, now." Before he could press further, Officer Lang raised a hand slightly, his voice steady. "Hold on. Brad, let's see the boarding passes before we escalate this." Kane shot him an impatient look. "He's obstructing the crew. What more do we need to know?" Lang's eyes flicked toward Malcolm, then Sterling. "We need to know the facts. That's what we're here for." For the first time, Sterling's expression faltered. His certainty wavered as Lang's calm logic threatened to pierce the comfortable narrative he had constructed. Clara shifted uneasily, her eyes darting between the two officers. Malcolm remained still, his voice even. "My pass is right here." He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and handed the slip of paper to Lang. The officer studied it, then glanced at Kane before speaking. Seat 1A, confirmed. A hush rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exhaled audibly, relief and vindication passing across their faces. Others looked away, ashamed that it had taken so long for something so simple to be acknowledged. Sterling bristled, his voice sharp. "That can't be right. My seat is 1A. I always fly in 1A. Lang extended his hand calmly. "Your boarding pass, sir." Sterling hesitated, his jaw clenched as though the simple request was an affront to his dignity. Finally, with exaggerated irritation, he pulled the slip from his pocket and handed it over. Lang examined it carefully, then raised his eyes. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Your seat is 14F, economy class." The words landed like thunder. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some with barely concealed satisfaction, others shaking their heads at the absurdity of what they had witnessed. Sterling's face flushed crimson. "This is a mistake. There must be some mix-up." He reached for the pass as though snatching back his dignity. But the truth had already been spoken aloud, exposed under the sterile light of the cabin. Clara's mouth opened slightly, her composure faltering. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. The authority she had worn so confidently only moments before, now slipping away. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply sat, his posture unchanged, his eyes calm. Dignity, quiet and unbroken, radiated from him. Officer Kane's scowl deepened, as though reluctant to admit he had nearly forced an innocent man from his rightful seat. Lang, however, nodded slightly to Malcolm, an unspoken recognition passing between them. The silence broke when a passenger in row 3 clapped once, sharply. Another followed. Soon, scattered applause rose in the cabin, not loud but steady, a quiet acknowledgement of truth finally revealed. Isabella Vega's phone captured every moment, her live stream now buzzing across the digital ether, carrying this confrontation beyond the confines of the airplane. Sterling muttered under his breath, sinking into the aisle seat he had claimed so confidently moments earlier. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. Malcolm finally spoke, his tone calm, his words measured. "You're right. It isn't." The meaning of his words hung in the air, deeper than Sterling could understand. For this was not just about a seat, not even about a flight. It was about a truth that had been forced into the light. Undeniable now. Irreversible. Evelyn tried to regain control, her voice shaky as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be resuming shortly." But the authority had drained from her voice, replaced by the knowledge that her actions had been witnessed, recorded, and judged not only by those on the plane, but by the world outside. Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt the weight of the ordeal pressing down on him, but beneath it was something else, a quiet strength, a certainty that his refusal to yield had mattered. The storm inside him had not subsided, but it had shifted, transformed into resolve. Officer Lang handed back Malcolm's boarding pass with a nod. "You're good here, sir." The simple acknowledgement carried more weight than the words themselves. It was validation, overdue but necessary. Malcolm nodded in return, his voice low. "Thank you." The officers withdrew toward the front of the plane, Kane still bristling, Lang calm and deliberate. The cabin remained thick with tension, but the truth now sat like an anchor in the room, Isabella lowered her phone slightly, her eyes locking with Malcolm's again. This time, she mouthed the single word, respect. He gave her the smallest of nods. The plane had not yet moved, but something profound had already shifted. The truth was out, the lies dismantled, the prejudice laid bare for all to see. And, though Sterling slumped in bitter silence, though Clara and Evelyn tried to gather the frayed edges of their authority, the damage was done. The world beyond these walls was already watching. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. He knew this was only the beginning. The plane remained at the gate, engines humming idly, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Sterling Whitford slumped in the aisle seat, his arrogance deflated, his face pale beneath the wash of fluorescent light. Clara Jennings busied herself with pointless tasks, adjusting tray tables, checking seat belts, anything to avoid the eyes that followed her now with open judgment. Evelyn Cross stood rigid near the galley, her posture stiff but her authority visibly cracked. Malcolm Harlow sat in 1A, his body still, his face composed, but inside his mind reeled with the gravity of what had just unfolded. He had stood firm, and the truth had been revealed. Yet he sensed this moment would not be contained within the narrow walls of the cabin. Something larger had been set in motion. Across the aisle, Isabella Vega lowered her phone just enough to glance at the glowing screen. The live stream counter ticked upward, rapidly, thousands of viewers, then tens of thousands, climbing in real time. Comments poured in so quickly she could barely keep up, but the words leapt off the screen: outrage, support, disbelief. Hashtags were forming, spreading like wildfire. She felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of knowing she was capturing something historic. The man beside her leaned in, whispering, "Are you streaming this?" Isabella nodded slightly. "People need to see." He sat back, stunned, muttering, "Good, good." Malcolm noticed the glow of her screen, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the phone. He realized then that his decision to remain seated, to refuse surrender, was no longer just his own battle. The world outside was already watching, judging, reacting. The weight of that realization settled over him like a cloak, heavy but empowering. Evelyn approached him once more, her voice strained, carefully measured. "Sir, I trust you understand the disruption this has caused. We need to restore order before we can proceed." Malcolm's eyes lifted to hers, calm and unwavering. "Order was never disrupted by me. It was disrupted by the refusal to acknowledge the truth. I am seated where I belong. That fact has been proven." Her lips pressed tightly together. She wanted to argue, to reassert control, but the evidence was undeniable. Every passenger had witnessed it. Many had recorded it. Some had even applauded. She was losing the narrative, and she knew it. Clara, hovering behind her, muttered under her breath, "This has gone too far." Malcolm heard her, but chose not to respond. His restraint was deliberate, his silence now a statement in itself. Sterling shifted, unable to endure the silence any longer. "You people don't get it," he snapped, his voice louder than before, laced with desperation. "I fly first class on this airline all the time. Everyone here knows me. This whole thing is some kind of mistake." But the passengers no longer looked at him with sympathy. Their stares were hard now, their disbelief open. Someone scoffed audibly, another whispered, entitled jerk. The tide of opinion had turned. and Sterling felt it pressing against him like a rising wave. Isabella's phone buzzed with notifications. She glanced again. National outlets had already picked up the live stream. Clips were being shared, headlines forming. Her heart pounded with the knowledge that she was no longer just a witness, she was a conduit. Malcolm sensed the shift too. He leaned back, his gaze turning toward the window, watching the blinking lights on the tarmac. He thought of his son again, of the lesson this moment carried. Not just about dignity, but about truth. Truth could not be silenced once it had been spoken aloud and seen by many. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, weary but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are awaiting final clearance before departure. Please remain seated." He said nothing about the confrontation, nothing about the storm that had unfolded in first class, but everyone knew. Evelyn stepped back, pulling Clara aside. Their hushed voices carried just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. "This is spiraling," Evelyn said. "We can't control it anymore. If corporate hears about this before we're in the air." Clara's response was sharp, defensive. It wasn't our fault. He should have just moved. Evelyn's glare silenced her. Fault won't matter. Perception will. Malcolm caught fragments of their conversation, his ears attuned to the cracks in their composure. For years, he had operated in boardrooms where perception was power, where controlling the narrative determined who won and who lost. He recognized now that they were losing control, and no amount of professional polish could reclaim it. A voice broke the silence, a woman in row 3, her tone clear, cutting through the air. Why hasn't anyone apologized to him? The question lingered. No crew member answered. Passengers turned their heads, their eyes settling on Evelyn and Clara. Their silence was damning. Malcolm didn't smile, but he felt the warmth of validation flicker in his chest. At last, someone else had spoken aloud what needed to be said. The silence was no longer absolute. Isabella's camera caught it all, the question, the silence, the shifting weight of judgment. Her feed surged again, thousands more joining, the comments exploding with indignation. Words like justice and accountability scrolled past her screen. Sterling fumed, his fists clenching on the armrests of his seat. His voice was low but seething. "You think you've won. This isn't over. People like me don't lose to people like you." Malcolm turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Then perhaps it's time you learned." The exchange was quiet, but passengers near the front heard it, their eyes widening. Isabella caught every syllable, her viewers reacting in real time, their outrage boiling over into demands for accountability. The cabin vibrated with a new kind of energy now, no longer the oppressive silence of prejudice unchallenged, but the restless current of change beginning to stir. Malcolm could feel it in his bones, the sense that something irreversible had already begun. He folded his hands in his lap, his breathing steady. The fight was far from over, but the balance had shifted, and he was no longer standing alone. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. Inside the plane, however, truth had found its voice. And with Isabella's lens capturing every flicker, the world was listening. The plane was still at the gate, but it felt like the entire world had already boarded with them. Every seat carried the weight of judgment. Every silence carried a voice unspoken. The hum of the engines underscored the unease, steady and low, as though the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Malcolm Harlow remained seated in 1A, his posture calm but his mind alert. He could sense the ripples spreading beyond the cabin now, out through the invisible threads of Isabella Vega's live stream into homes and offices far from the tarmac. The truth was no longer theirs to contain. Up in the cockpit, Captain Robert Gaines adjusted his headset nervously. His first officer, a younger man with cautious eyes, leaned toward him. "Sir, I just got a message from operations. They're monitoring a situation in first class." Gaines frowned. "Monitoring? What situation?" The first officer hesitated. "It's already online. A passenger is streaming live. It's gone viral." Gaines swore under his breath. He toggled the comms and called ground control, his voice tense. Within moments, he was patched through to the airline's corporate office. In a sleek tower miles away, phones buzzed, notifications screamed, and executives scrambled. Jonathan Pierce, the CEO of the airline, was pulled from a late dinner by his chief of staff. Within minutes, he was watching the live stream on a tablet, his expression darkening with every frame. "This is a disaster," muttered one vice president. "The optics are catastrophic." Pierce raised a hand for silence. His voice was sharp, decisive. "Get me the captain. Now." Back in the cockpit, Gaines stiffened as the call connected. "Mr. Pierce, this is Captain Gaines." Pierce's voice cut through the line like steel. "Captain, I'm watching your flight right now. What in God's name is happening in first class?" Gaines cleared his throat. "There was a seat dispute. Security was called to resolve it. The situation is under control." "Under control," Pierce snapped. "I'm watching one of our passengers humiliated, accused without proof, and treated like a criminal while sitting in a seat he purchased. This isn't under control. This is a crisis." The first officer glanced nervously at his captain. Gaines swallowed hard. "What would you like me to do?" Sir Pierce's reply was cold, deliberate. "You will not take that plane into the air until I speak directly with the passenger in seat 1A. Patch me through to him. Now." Moments later, Evelyn Cross received the message from the cockpit. Her face paled as she processed the instructions. She had spent her entire career wielding authority in the cabin. Her word final. Now the chain of command had leapt over her head, straight to the highest office. She approached Malcolm reluctantly, her voice tight. "Sir, the captain has requested that you take a call from our CEO." A hush fell over the surrounding rows. Passengers leaned in, unable to disguise their curiosity. Sterling Whitford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the color draining from his face. Even Clara Jennings froze, her professional mask cracking. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "The CEO." "Yes," Evelyn said, forcing politeness. "He wishes to speak with you directly." Malcolm considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Very well." Evelyn handed him the handset from the wall near the galley. Malcolm accepted it with steady hands, pressing it to his ear. The cabin seemed to lean closer, every passenger straining to catch even fragments of the exchange. "Mr. Harlow," came the voice, low and controlled. "This is Jonathan Pierce. I'm the chief executive of the airline." Malcolm's reply was calm, but it carried the quiet weight of a man unshaken. "Mr. Pierce, I assume you've been watching." "I have," Pierce said. "And let me say first that what I've seen is unacceptable. You purchased that seat. You had every right to occupy it. The way you've been treated does not reflect this company's values. I want to personally apologize." Gasps rippled softly through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, astonished to hear such words coming from the highest authority. Isabella's phone captured every second, the live stream exploding with comments as viewers realized they were hearing history unfold in real time. Malcolm listened, his silence deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. An apology does not erase what has happened. The humiliation, the assumptions, the bias, it is larger than this one flight. I know, Pierce said quickly, and we will address it, starting immediately. The staff involved will be removed from duty pending investigation, and I will see to it personally that systemic reforms follow. But for now, Mr. Harlow, I need your cooperation so this flight can continue. Malcolm glanced around the cabin, at the faces watching him, at Isabella's phone recording, at Sterling shrinking into his seat. He understood the power of this moment. It wasn't just about him. It was about what would be remembered, what would be carried forward beyond tonight. He spoke slowly, deliberately. Mr. Pierce, I will cooperate. But not in silence. The world has seen what happened here. If you mean what you say about reform, then prove it not with words but with action. Pierce exhaled heavily. You have my word. The line went quiet, then disconnected. Malcolm handed the handset back to Evelyn, who avoided his gaze. Her face flushed. The cabin erupted in hushed conversation. Passengers whispered in disbelief, in awe. Some looked at Malcolm with newfound respect, others with unease at the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Sterling shifted again, unable to contain himself. This is absurd, calling the CEO over a seat. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No one responded, no one supported him. His words hung in the air like smoke, quickly dissipating, leaving him isolated in his own bitterness. Malcolm turned his head, his voice calm but edged with quiet power. This was never about a seat. It was about truth. The truth had spoken, and it was still echoing. Isabella's feed surged past 1 million viewers, hashtags trending across platforms. The story was already out of the airline's control, already shaping itself in the eyes of the world. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He could feel the shift, the pivot point in history where silence cracked and something new emerged. The battle was not over, but the tide was turning. The engines thrummed beneath him, waiting. But Malcolm knew that whatever destination this plane reached, the real journey had already begun. The handset clicked back into its cradle, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any turbulence. The CEO's voice still echoed in the cabin, his apology reverberating through every passenger's mind. It was a rare moment when corporate power had been pulled into the tight, pressurized space of an aircraft cabin, and no one could quite believe they had witnessed it. Malcolm Harlow sat quietly, his expression calm but his thoughts racing. He knew what had just happened was extraordinary, but he also knew it was only the beginning. Words were easy. Promises came quickly when reputations were on the line. Action, however, was the true test. Evelyn Cross looked shaken. Her composure rattled. For the first time in years, her authority in the cabin felt like paper armor, fragile and exposed. Clara Jennings stood stiffly beside her, her face flushed with the sting of humiliation. Neither woman spoke, but the silence between them was loud enough for everyone to hear. Then the intercom crackled. Captain Gaines's voice filled the cabin, his tone carefully measured. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. As directed by our corporate office, 2 members of our cabin crew will be stepping off this flight and replaced by reserve staff before departure. We apologize for the delay. Gasps spread through the cabin like a ripple across water. Heads turned instantly toward Evelyn and Clara. Evelyn's lips parted in protest, her eyes flashing, but she said nothing. Clara's shoulders slumped as though the air had been knocked out of her. Without a word, they gathered their belongings, their polished steps faltering now under the scrutiny of dozens of watchful eyes. As Evelyn moved down the aisle, a passenger muttered, "About time." Another whispered, "They deserved it." The words weren't shouted, but they carried the weight of judgment. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed the crack in her armor. Clara followed closely behind, her face pale, avoiding every gaze. Malcolm didn't gloat, he didn't smile or nod, he simply watched, his expression unreadable, his hands folded in his lap. Victory, if it could be called that, was not sweet. It was sobering. These women were not just individuals, they were part of a system that had failed countless times before. Removing them would not heal the wound, it would only reveal how deep it ran. Sterling Whitford sat frozen in his seat. His jaw clenched. The spectacle had shifted, and he was no longer the center of righteous authority, but the embodiment of arrogance exposed. Passengers glanced at him now with disdain, whispering to each other. His entitlement, once unquestioned, was now a stain he could not scrub away. Isabella Vega's phone buzzed non-stop. Her live stream had surpassed 2 million viewers, comments flying faster than she could read. Major news outlets had begun embedding the feed, and hashtags calling for accountability were trending globally. She glanced at Malcolm, catching his calm profile, and felt a surge of awe. Here was a man who had transformed humiliation into dignity, silence into truth, all without raising his voice. Replacement crew members boarded quietly, their faces tight with professionalism, aware they were stepping into a story far larger than a delayed flight. They offered polite smiles, careful not to meet Malcolm's eyes too directly, as though acknowledging him might be read as taking sides. The plane seemed to exhale as the process dragged on. Passengers adjusted their seats, murmured to each other, processed what they had just witnessed. Some leaned toward Malcolm, offering quiet words of support. "We're with you," said the woman in row 3 who had earlier demanded an apology. "Thank you for standing your ground," said a man across the aisle. Their voices carried the sincerity of those who knew they had stayed silent too long, and now sought to make amends in whispers. Malcolm acknowledged them with a nod, his voice soft. "Thank you." Yet he knew their words, though kind, carried little weight compared to the silence that had preceded them. Courage was rare in the moment it was needed most. Sterling finally broke his silence, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "This is ridiculous. You people are making a hero out of him for sitting in a chair." His tone dripped with bitterness, but the venom no longer carried power. Passengers shifted away from him, their expressions cold. One man muttered, "Just let it go." Sterling sank back, his fists tight, his pride battered. Malcolm turned his gaze to the window. The tarmac lights blinked steadily, a reminder of the world beyond this metal tube, the world now watching. He thought of his son again, of how the boy would see this moment replayed on screens, dissected by strangers, remembered in headlines. Would he see his father's dignity? Would he understand that calm resistance could be more powerful than anger, that truth could prevail, even when surrounded by lies. The engines whirred louder as the aircraft prepared for pushback. Yet Malcolm felt as though they had already traveled miles. What began as a simple boarding process had become a microcosm of history itself, entitlement exposed, silence shattered, accountability demanded. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. Exhaustion tugged at him, but so did resolve. He had not asked for this confrontation, but he had chosen to stand firm when it came, and that choice had turned a quiet humiliation into a loud reckoning. As the plane finally taxied toward the runway, Isabella raised her phone once more, capturing Malcolm's calm silhouette against the cabin window. Her caption was simple but powerful. "Dignity doesn't move." Within minutes, it was everywhere. The plane lifted into the night sky, engines roaring, carrying not just passengers to their destinations, but a story that would not be left behind at the gate. Malcolm gazed out at the city lights shrinking below. He thought of the call from Jonathan Pierce, of the promises made in haste, of the consequences that had already begun. But, above all, he thought of the truth that had been revealed in full view of strangers and millions online. The truth was in motion now, unstoppable. The engines roared, pressing everyone back into their seats as the plane finally left the runway. After what felt like an eternity of delays, the aircraft clawed its way into the night sky. The lights of the city glittered below, a scattering of jewels slowly shrinking into the dark. Inside the cabin, however, silence lingered like a ghost. The passengers, though buckled and secured, were restless, caught between relief that the flight was finally underway and the heavy residue of what they had witnessed. Malcolm Harlow sat still, his eyes fixed on the window. The city disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds, but his mind remained firmly grounded. He replayed every word, every glance, every humiliation. He could feel again the sting of Clara's dismissive tone, the condescension in Sterling's voice, the cold certainty in Evelyn's orders. But he could also hear Isabella's voice in his memory, clear and firm, asking why no one had apologized. That question had cracked something open in the cabin. It had made the silence less suffocating. A soft chime signaled the release of seatbelts. The crew moved down the aisles with trays and practiced efficiency. Though their eyes carried unease, the new attendants worked with nervous precision, acutely aware of the history written into every gesture. They spoke with even tones, offered polite smiles, avoided any suggestion of favoritism. A man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Malcolm. His voice was low, meant only for him. "You handled that with more grace than I could have. Thank you." Malcolm turned his head, offering a faint nod. It wasn't about grace, it was about necessity. The man looked down, ashamed. Still, it mattered. From a few rows back, the woman who had spoken earlier leaned forward. "You showed us something tonight. Most of us stayed quiet when we shouldn't have. I won't forget that." Her words carried further than she intended, rippling through the nearby seats. Passengers nodded subtly, their eyes shifting toward Malcolm with a mix of respect and regret. The solidarity came late, but it was beginning to take root. Sterling Whitford sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the armrests as though he could still control the narrative by sheer force of will. His eyes darted around, catching the looks of disdain, the whispers he could not silence. He muttered under his breath, too soft for anyone but Malcolm to hear. "They'll forget about this by tomorrow. People always do." Malcolm turned his head slowly, his eyes steady. Not this time. Sterling sneered but said nothing more. He felt the weight of isolation pressing in, the shift of a crowd that had once indulged his entitlement now turning against him. Meanwhile, Isabella Vega typed furiously on her phone, updating her feed. Her words poured out quickly, sharp and precise, the instinct of a journalist capturing history as it unfolded. She described the CEO's direct intervention, the removal of crew members, the way passengers had slowly found their voices. Every detail fed into the storm already raging online. She glanced up at Malcolm, studying his calm demeanor, and felt a surge of admiration. He hadn't asked for attention, hadn't raised his voice, but his presence was reshaping everything. Malcolm noticed her watching him. He gave her the faintest nod, acknowledging her role. Without her camera, without her courage to film, the truth might have been buried beneath official reports and polished statements. She had carried the truth into the light. As the cabin lights dimmed, Malcolm allowed himself a moment of inward reflection. He thought of his father again, of that night at the gas station, of the humiliation swallowed in silence. He thought of his own early career, when colleagues had doubted him, when investors had second-guessed him, when he had chosen restraint again and again. He had believed for years that survival required silence, but tonight had proved otherwise. Tonight had shown that silence only preserved the lie, while presence, calm and unyielding, revealed the truth. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the hum of the engines, the press of air around the fuselage. Somewhere above the clouds, he found clarity. This fight had never been about a seat, or even about him alone. It was about every person who had ever been asked to move, to shrink, to step aside for the comfort of others. It was about dignity reclaimed. The quiet broke when a young man across the aisle, maybe in his 20s, spoke up. His voice was hesitant but clear. "Sir, I just want to say thank you. My father, he went through something similar once. He never talked about it, but I could see how it stayed with him. What you did tonight, it means something to people like us." Malcolm met the young man's eyes and gave a slow nod. He didn't need to say more. The weight of unspoken history hung between them, understood without words. Further back, the murmur of conversation grew. Passengers who had remained silent earlier now spoke more freely, some condemning the crew's actions, others marveling at how quickly the story had gone viral. The cabin had transformed from a stage of silent witnesses to a forum of reluctant truth-tellers. Sterling sat deeper in his seat, shrinking into irrelevance. His words carried no weight now, his entitlement stripped bare. He was no longer the voice of authority, he was the cautionary tale unfolding in real time. Malcolm turned his gaze back to the window, watching the endless night outside. His thoughts drifted to San Francisco, to the keynote he was meant to deliver. He realized that speech would never be the same. The words he had prepared about leadership, about dignity in turbulent times, now felt pale compared to what had transpired here. Tomorrow, he would not need to rely on crafted lines. He would have a story that spoke for itself, lived and witnessed by millions. The plane cruised steadily now, a metal bird slicing through the dark. But inside, something larger was in motion. A reckoning had begun, carried not only by Malcolm's calm defiance but by the eyes and voices of those who had seen it and finally chosen to speak. Malcolm exhaled slowly. a deep calm settling in his chest. He knew the storm was far from over. Corporate promises would need to be tested, accountability demanded, reforms fought for. But tonight, he had planted a seed, and seeds, once planted in truth, had a way of growing, no matter how hard the soil. The plane droned steadily through the night, its nose angled westward as the hours passed in uneasy quiet. Somewhere below, towns and cities flickered with light, but inside the cabin, the air was heavy with anticipation. Passengers scrolled their phones restlessly. Whispers carried down the aisles, and every so often the glow of Isabella Vega's screen cast a pale reflection across her face. Malcolm Harlow sat motionless in 1A, his eyes on the window, though his thoughts were far beyond the clouds. His body was calm, but his mind pulsed with a steady rhythm. The confrontation was over, at least for now, but the consequences were only beginning. He knew how stories like this traveled, how quickly they grew beyond the individuals involved, morphing into symbols, into lightning rods for larger truths. He glanced at Isabella as she tapped furiously at her phone. The live stream had ended hours ago, but clips were everywhere now, stitched into news segments, dissected on social media, debated by strangers across the globe. He hadn't asked for the attention, yet he understood the responsibility it carried. His face, his voice, his choice to remain seated, they had become part of the narrative already spiraling out of the cabin's control. A chime signaled the cabin lights dimming further, but sleep was scarce. Conversations flickered between passengers, sometimes hushed, sometimes heated. A man in a row 4 muttered that he hadn't signed up for activism at 30,000 feet, while a woman across the aisle reminded him that silence was exactly what had allowed injustice to persist. Their words drifted forward, fragments of a larger argument echoing across society. Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He thought of San Francisco, of the keynote speech he was scheduled to give. He imagined stepping onto that stage tomorrow, knowing that half the audience would have already seen him online, not as a businessman, but as the man who refused to move. His carefully prepared words about leadership in turbulent times now felt almost irrelevant. The turbulence had already found him, mid-air, and forced him to lead without a podium. The seatbelt sign chimed again, breaking his thoughts. A new flight attendant, part of the reserve crew, approached him quietly. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Mr. Harlow, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. It shouldn't have unfolded the way it did." Malcolm studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Her eyes flickered with something unspoken fear, perhaps, or guilt by association. She straightened quickly and moved on, but her brief acknowledgement hung in the air, a reminder that even within the system there were cracks where humanity seeped through. Sterling Whitford had grown quieter as the flight continued, but bitterness radiated from him like heat. He ordered 2 drinks in quick succession, his voice clipped, his posture rigid. He muttered under his breath, occasionally loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is insane. Everyone's overreacting." Yet no one responded. His words dissolved into the hum of the engines, irrelevant now. Malcolm turned his gaze back to the window, but his reflection stared back at him, layered over the night sky. He thought of his son again. Would the boy see strength in this, or would he see only the danger that his father had risked humiliation, even removal, by refusing to yield? Malcolm wrestled with the question. the familiar tug-of-war between survival and dignity. But in his heart, he knew the answer. His son would see a man who had chosen not to shrink. That mattered more than safety. Across the aisle, Isabella caught his eye. She leaned forward slightly, speaking in a low voice. It's everywhere now. CNN, MSNBC, even international outlets. They're calling it the first-class incident. Malcolm exhaled slowly. The world moves fast. She tilted her head. Do you regret it? He paused, considering the weight of the question. No, but I know what comes next won't be easy. Isabella nodded knowingly. She was young, but she understood how stories became storms, how people became symbols. People are rallying behind you. They see what happened. They won't let it fade. Malcolm gave her the faintest smile. We'll see. The captain's voice broke in over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into San Francisco. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. A ripple of motion spread through the cabin as passengers adjusted their seats, secured their trays, and braced for arrival. But the atmosphere carried more than the usual anticipation of landing. Everyone knew that when the doors opened, they would be stepping into more than just an airport. They would be stepping into the aftermath of a story already larger than themselves. Malcolm straightened in his seat, his body bracing not just for descent, but for impact. He imagined the terminal filled with reporters, the flash of cameras, the press of questions. He imagined corporate executives scrambling to frame their narrative, politicians seizing the story to make their points, strangers arguing in comment sections. The battle was no longer about one man's dignity on one flight. It had become part of the larger reckoning his country wrestled with every day. Sterling finally spoke again, his voice low and bitter. When this is over, I'll have my lawyers on this airline. You'll see. Money talks. Malcolm turned his head, his eyes steady. Truth speaks louder. Sterling looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The plane descended steadily, the city lights of San Francisco sprawling across the horizon like a constellation brought to Earth. Passengers craned their necks to see, but Malcolm remained focused inward. His thoughts gathered like a tide, preparing him for what awaited. He whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "Stand firm." The landing gear thumped down, the aircraft jolting slightly as it aligned with the runway. A few passengers clapped softly when the wheels touched, a habit of nervous relief. But the cabin did not erupt in chatter as usual. Instead, silence lingered, heavy with the knowledge that what awaited outside was larger than the flight itself. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Malcolm straightened his jacket, his hands steady. He could see movement through the window's cameras, officials, a crowd already gathering. Isabella leaned forward, whispering, "They're waiting for you." Malcolm gave her a quiet nod. He had not chosen this stage, but he would not shrink from it. The engines powered down, the cabin lights flickered brighter, and the familiar chime signaled the opening of doors. Passengers stirred, gathering bags, stretching stiff limbs, but no one rushed for the exit. All eyes turned to Malcolm. For a moment, he remained seated, grounded in his own stillness. Then he rose, calm and deliberate, as though the entire weight of history rested on his shoulders. The storm had carried him this far. Now it was time to step into the aftermath. The chime sounded, and the cabin door hissed open. Cool air from the jet bridge swept into the aircraft, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. Passengers unbuckled their belts and reached for their bags, but unlike most arrivals, no one rushed forward. Instead, they glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Malcolm Harlow sat in 1A, calm and still, as though rooted to the leather seat. From the windows, he could already see flashes of light strobing in the terminal. Cameras, phones, reporters, they were all waiting. The live stream had pulled them here like moths to flame. What had begun as a confrontation over a seat had become a story that the world demanded to witness firsthand. A flight attendant from the replacement crew approached him softly. "Mr. Harlow, if you'd like, you may disembark first." Malcolm met her eyes. She looked nervous, aware of the gravity of the moment. He gave her a faint nod. "Thank you." He rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, his movements deliberate. The passengers around him fell quiet, watching. Some nodded respectfully, others murmured words of encouragement. A few clapped softly, not in celebration, but in recognition. Even those who had remained silent during the ordeal now seemed to understand they had been part of something larger. Sterling Whitford stayed hunched in his seat, his face pale and tight. He avoided Malcolm's gaze, muttering curses under his breath. Whatever power he thought he held had evaporated in the glare of exposure. He was no longer the man of authority. He was the man who had been revealed. Malcolm stepped into the aisle. His shoes pressed firmly against the carpet as he walked toward the open door. Each step carried the weight of memory, of history, of the thousands of silent indignities borne by people like him. Tonight, silence had broken. As he entered the jet bridge, the flashes intensified. The glow of cameras painted the walls in bursts of white. Reporters leaned forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions. "Mr. Harlow, how do you feel after what happened on the flight? Do you plan to sue the airline? What message do you want to send tonight?" The barrage was relentless, but Malcolm did not rush. He moved with the same calm that had anchored him in seat 1A. He stopped just short of the terminal entrance, turned, and faced the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was clear, steady, and low enough that the press leaned in to catch every word. What happened tonight was not about a seat. It was about dignity. It was about the assumption that some of us do not belong. No matter what we've earned, no matter what proof we hold in our hands, that assumption is older than any airline, and it cannot be allowed to continue. The cameras flashed wildly, the crowd leaning closer. Malcolm paused, letting his words settle before continuing. I was calm, because anger would have played into their expectations. I was firm, because surrender would have validated their prejudice. And I was not alone, every one of you saw it. And millions more saw it because one person had the courage to film. That matters. Bearing witness matters. He looked directly into the cameras, his eyes steady. This airline has promised accountability. We will see if those promises are honored. But I tell you, this silence is no longer an option. Not for me, not for any of us. The reporters erupted again, shouting questions, but Malcolm stepped back, raising a hand gently. "Tonight, I'm going home to my family. Tomorrow, I will speak more. But for now, remember what you saw. Remember how it made you feel. And ask yourself, how many times have you stayed silent when you should have spoken? With that," he moved forward, past the flashing lights and the crowd of microphones, into the terminal. Passengers followed behind him slowly, their faces still marked by awe. Some placed hands briefly on his shoulder as they passed, small gestures of solidarity. Isabella Vega emerged soon after, her phone still buzzing with notifications. A reporter spotted her and asked, "Were you the one streaming?" She nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, people needed to see." The cameras turned on her for a moment, capturing her young face, her quiet resolve. She knew her role had been pivotal, but she also knew the story was bigger than her. It was Malcolm's presence that had anchored it. His refusal to yield that had made it resonate. In a corporate office across the country, Jonathan Pierce watched the footage live. His face was grim. He knew the company stood on the edge of a storm unlike any it had faced before. Promises would not be enough. The world demanded action, and Malcolm Harlow's words had set the standard by which that action would be measured. Back in the terminal, Sterling emerged at last, shielded by airline staff, his head low. Cameras still flashed, but the attention was different now. He was not the center of the story. He was the cautionary detail, the symbol of entitlement laid bare. He hurried past the press, muttering under his breath, but his words were lost in the noise. Malcolm moved quietly through the terminal, his steps unhurried. The crowd parted slightly, giving him space, as though they understood the magnitude of his presence. He felt the exhaustion in his bones, but beneath it pulsed something stronger. Resolve. This was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a larger fight, one he had not sought but could not ignore. As he reached the exit, he paused for a moment, turning back to look at the sea of faces, the flashing lights, the echoes of questions still ringing in the air. He thought again of his son, of the lessons carried in silence and in action. Tonight, he hoped, he had given him a new lesson, that dignity, once defended, could echo louder than prejudice. He stepped into the cool night air of San Francisco. The storm of cameras faded behind him, but the storm of change had only just begun. As Malcolm Harlow stepped off the plane into the glare of cameras, the story no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to every person who had ever been told they did not belong. His calm defiance became a mirror, forcing the world to see what it would rather look away from. We saw arrogance crumble, authority questioned, and silence broken. We saw passengers wrestle with their own choices whether to look away or to stand up. And in the end, we saw dignity remain unshaken, even when pressed by prejudice. This was not just about a seat in first class. It was about the seat every one of us deserves at the table of respect. It was about how justice begins in the smallest of places, a boarding gate, a crowded aisle, a single voice refusing to move. As we close this story, carry its weight with you. Remember the cost of silence, remember the power of presence, and remember that discrimination, no matter how subtle, is never acceptable. If this story moved you, let it move others too. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel and join us for the next story that demands to be heard.